So I am McPherson. I direct the Investor Environmental Health Network, which is a part of Clean Production Action. And I'm really happy to welcome you to our session on pressing for corporate action on environmental justice. So for this session and for our soon to be released paper on the business case for environmental justice, we're using the Environmental Protection Agency's environmental definition up on the screen today, just for your reference. Environmental justice has always been a key value for the Investor Environmental Health Network, and that's why we're really happy to be collaborating with ICCR to support what we believe is the first investor-led environmental justice working group on this issue, and we're going to talk about that more today. So this panel is going to include a variety of expertise and perspectives, including academic, community-based, and investor. And the discussion will focus on how available data and community demands can help direct and inform investor engagement to successfully press companies for meaningful and positive change. So for our format, we're going to start with brief openers. We have 5 panelists, so they're going to do fast openers. We have a lot more to share in the panel discussion, and they're going to really talk about their approach and define their work on environmental justice. So we'll start with the perspective of Tracy Gregoire with Coming Clean and their community-based environmental justice advocacy on the Campaign for Healthier Solutions and the Louisville Charter. Then we have Kayla Williams from Clean Production Action, who will share her work on environmental justice. This includes setting best practice with corporations, but also for our own organization, Clean Production Action. Then Michael Ash is joining us virtually with the University of Massachusetts. He's going to share an index that ranks companies on their toxic footprint and provides data on their environmental justice impacts. And we conclude our openers with Jillianne Lyon and her work with investor advocates for social justice, leading climate and environmental justice engagements, and establishing best practice on stakeholder engagement. And last but not least, Marissa LaFave with Parnassus, who co-leads this investor-led environmental justice group, will share her perspective on the business case for environmental justice and the work she's doing to set collective environmental expectations. So I'm going to hand it over to Tracy.
So a little bit about Coming Clean. The Coming Clean Network is a collaboration network working to transform the chemical industry. The network currently includes about 135 member organizations with over 350 individual participants. We currently host 8 collective teams that build and sustain joint work together on chemicals, climate, food and agriculture, cumulative impacts, dollar store work, hazardous chemical facilities, and other issues. Our focus is both on addressing the exposures and harms occurring now, which disproportionately affect communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous communities, and workers, while also building to transform the chemical industry. Our work is guided by and grounded by the Louisville Charter for Safer Chemicals, a collective roadmap to transform the industry, grounded in the needs and priorities of the most impacted communities. The Charter is a critical tool for collaboration. The Louisville Charter was originally developed in 2004 by a broad group of grassroots labor, health, environmental justice, and environmental organizations, first convened by grassroots leaders in Louisville, Kentucky, hence the name. It was revised and expanded by Coming Clean in 2021. The Charter is a collective vision and a set of principles for just and equitable industry transformation that leaves no community and no worker behind.
Maybe your organization is new when it comes to thinking about environmental justice. Clean Production Action is also at the beginning of our journey in fully integrating environmental justice into our strategic approach. The sociocultural events of 2020 and the tragedies of that year made it very clear to our organization and others in our circle that we had to take real time to analyze and understand the ways we were contributing to the oppressive systems that made those things happen at that time. And it became very clear in doing so that environmental justice is a critical component to our mission and our vision of a world in which no person, regardless of where they live, what their job is, how much money they have, are not going to become sick because of toxic chemicals in the built environment around them and the products that they use in their everyday life. So now Clean Production Action recognizes that a marketplace that is dependent on toxic chemicals is also therefore dependent on systemic racism and injustice and other systems of oppression. So at this point, we've undergone a lot of, organizational learning, offering shared learning opportunities to our staff so they can build up their own individual awareness so that we can come together and have productive conversations about how to integrate environmental justice into our work and our approach. And at this point, every decision we're trying to make from here on out, we have to consider the environmental justice impacts of the outcome.
Our aim is to help people move from the right to know. There's a lot of regulation in the United States via right to know to an actual exercisable right to clean air and clean water with an environmental justice perspective. So our project builds on EPA work and is an attempt to add value to the right to know to regulation by right to know. I tell my students in public policy frequently, what you measure is what you get. So it's very important that we measure the right outcomes if we want to move towards a more environmentally just and healthier and safer planet. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the details of our project. I'd like to encourage you to visit our easy to remember website, which is toxic100.org. I'll repeat, toxic100.org. And I encourage you to take a look at the output that we offer. We integrate work from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So this has the value of being high quality data undertaken using best practices and peer-reviewed methods. You may be familiar with the US EPA Toxics Release Inventory. Perhaps less familiar is a value-added data set from US EPA that builds on the Toxics Release Inventory to ask, what's the population health risk from the chemical releases that are recorded in the Toxics Release Inventory? We take that and run with it at the University of Massachusetts Amherst with the Corporate Toxics Information Project. We add two critical components: ownership and environmental justice. So ownership, we think about the corporate form as the most important facet of structuring economic life in the United States. And we think that final parent responsibility for the corporate pollution and environmental injustices created by industrial facilities is crucial. This addition of value partly reflects priorities and also masking at the in federal environmental regulation. The US EPA is heavily focused on the facility as the unit of analysis, and we think it's important to take a look at the final parent corporate owners. We also, since inception, have been committed to environmental justice. You've already seen the EPA definition. Our analysis focuses on environmental bads. It's also important to think about the distribution of environmental goods. We focus on environmental bads, exposure, disparities by poverty and race. We focus on environmental justice populations, and we produce a measure of the environmental justice share of the risk from toxics. I'll show you one way to take a look at that on the next slide, and I will wrap up. We are able to, if you take a look at this scatter plot, every dot in there is a corporation with environmental impact in the U.S. These are the top polluters on our Toxic 100 list. And we're able to, on the vertical axis, scale these corporate polluters on the basis of the total risk they create. We're also, thanks to our in-house efforts, able to measure these polluters by what share of their impact befalls, for example, non-white environmental justice communities. We also take a look at income separately and in combination with race and ethnic categories. So moving from left to right across this index, you can see the disproportionate impact. So what's a really difficult case corporation is one that is in the upper right corner of this diagram. Those are corporations that have both a high impact, a very high impact, and a particularly unequally distributed impact.
So a bit of how we work with environmental justice, IESJ really sees it as an intersectional lens that is centering racial equity in the just transition narrative. And a big data point that we used in kind of forming and carrying out this campaign came from a few studies in the early 2020s that have shown that overall in the US, exposure to pollution has decreased significantly. But in communities of color, that exposure to pollution has actually remained stagnant over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And in some cases, it's actually increased. So we know from that mainstream environmental movements and improved regulations and protections have not been effective. And as Kayla said, in a lot of ways, they've just redistributed the harm. We also see that climate damages are following that same path of least resistance and into these communities who are really sitting on the front lines. And whether or not this was done with malicious intent, by design, companies are concentrating their impacts in these types of communities, which is obviously a huge problem. So IESJ has really aimed for our Climate and Dignity Initiative to address that gap. And as you can see up on this slide, we've kind of mapped out the impacts from our companies onto kind of what we consider some of the most frontline environmental justice controversies really playing out on the ground for our focus companies. So as you can see, some examples include, pipeline projects when you're looking at both Indigenous communities, other communities of color, where from start to finish, where that infrastructure is going through. There's also examples, I think we've pulled up Plant Berry, which is a coal facility, which is located in a majority Black community. And you're looking at both what are the ongoing impacts of that, but also when that plant retires, what's going to happen to the toxic chemical waste that's going to be left behind. So just to show that there are examples across all of our climate concerns where it intersects with environmental justice.
So really, there's been a confluence of factors, again, since 2020 that lead to a growing business case on the corporate action for environmental justice and therefore the investor action. And really, there's been a growing recognition of the need to address environmental justice among not only lawmakers, but the public more broadly, which has led, primarily to stronger policy and regulation at the federal and at the state levels. 19 states have enacted environmental justice legislation since 2020, and many, many more have pending legislation currently being discussed and determined. And the federal government has taken has made unprecedented commitments on environmental justice and how to integrate that into all federal agencies and how to understand environmental justice from the policy level. This has also led to the integration of environmental justice expectations into permitting and contracting decisions for facilities and for projects. So companies are starting to be kind of put up against each other to understand, what are the impacts of a new facility or an expanded facility or new plant. And if those impacts are going to be disparate on communities of color, what is the company doing to avoid that? Or they might just not get their permit at all. And we've seen that a few times. This has also led, to increased availability of and access to localized pollution data. This is extremely important because we can use localized data, pollution data, to attribute health and environmental outcomes to pollution sources, and that really bolsters litigation for communities who are suffering but didn't have the proof, before to show.
But what we see often happen, whether it's investors or an ally organization like LDA, like the table's already set. Like, so for these tables, right, you set the table, you get the funding, you do the menu, you have the whole plan, strategic plan, and then you invite, the community and environmental justice organization to the table and say, okay, here's our plan. What do you think about it? Right. So instead, really thinking about how do you reach out, make those connections. And I'm happy to try to be that collaborator or be that person to kind of reach out to some of these groups who are dealing with literally facilities on fire in their community and like just, everyday hazards that they have to put out, right? How do you, build a really authentic relationship so it's mutually beneficial, and really work on their timeline, their process, and really let the community speak for themselves.
And also our recommendations, for ourselves that we followed are the same recommendations that we've given companies on how they interact with communities is, make a commitment, make a public commitment, build up a policy for your organization on how to do this work, factor in equity to that. Something I would note when we started our journey and kind of working very intentionally with groups is we found it very easy to ally with white-led environmental and community groups. And I think it was just baked into how we approached relationship building and how we structured ourselves historically as an organization. And we had to intentionally set targets on partnering with Black and Indigenous-led groups and build into our process of how we form those relationships and build trust in that.
A risk-based approach, even if you're choosing low-risk options, means you're already doing something risky. So clean production action leads with a hazard-first approach because it is inherently more protective of human and environmental health. Again, we focus on chemicals, like chemical ingredients of formulated products and articles. And it has come up already this morning, but it's really not enough to follow regulations. It's just not enough. So a hazard first approach is also going to set you up to be good to go when government regulation or trade association regulations become more stringent over time or strict over time. And also a hazard first approach is really important in avoiding regrettable substitutes. So it's not just enough to stop using PFAS and use another chemical that is also carcinogenic. So a hazard first approach will also set you up better to not do that.
It's very important to embed environmental justice across the corporate decision-making process, and that includes both de-risking processes that already exist and are risky, but also, especially as companies make, say, science-based targets for climate change, for climate change mitigation, to make sure that those that those changes are subjected to an environmental justice lens. If there's an opportunity to integrate environmental justice into all aspects of corporate decision-making, what will decarbonization look like? What will new investment look like? And that's why I think it's important both to look through the risk lens, but also to look at the environmental goods side of environmental justice analysis, and to make sure that there are investments in healthy environmental production in locations that include communities of color, not simply trying to excise the risks, especially to excise unjust risks. So there is a big opportunity, I think, here as companies move forward in a period of change to embed environmental justice decision-making throughout.
There is actually a really good source of environmental justice data already in the United States. It's the EPA EJ Screen tool, where you can input an address, set a diameter, and see the community breakdown by race, by percent who speak English. It goes like down the whole line of kind of all the civil rights measurements that the U.S. government currently uses. And you can see that next to pollution data versus state and national percentiles. And so you have all this information. However, how many of us have the time to pull, let's say, the 3,000 facilities that a company might own, input them all manually, get PDFs out, not even Excel documents, and then somehow squash those all together and analyze that information to say the company has this impact? Like literally none of us can do that. And just as an example, Waste Management was the first company I engaged on this. Their name is literally Waste Management. I don't even know which facilities they own. Like I search Waste Management, it's like half of them aren't named Waste Management, even though they're owned by Waste Management. The other half are named Waste Management, but they are not owned by Waste Management. So you get the point. I mean, we can't do that, but the company can. The company knows the GPS coordinates of every single facility that they own. They have teams that should be doing this risk assessment anyway, but we need them to do that. And so unfortunately, oftentimes the first ask becomes a disclosure ask, because it's like, we just need the data. We need you to tell us where, how you're already performing, but they don't want to say that, because then we're reliant, without the data and without being able to correlate or show causation, we need controversies, we need lawsuits, and we need things that hit the news. The problem with that is that the voices of marginalized communities generally don't hit the news. And even since 2020, sure, they hit the news a little bit more, but still not nearly enough. And so this is an extremely localized issue. We're talking at the plant facility level, right? But it stems from a systemic issue, and we need mainstream attention, which is really difficult to capture on a single facility level about something that's so much deeper.